I am at the moment in this very privileged position to head the Environment Programme of the United Nations, which in turn is the entity in which governments come together to understand what science is telling us about the future of our planet, about risks, about threats, about also the challenges that we face in the broader context of development. The year 2015 is in the international calendar a year in which the discussions about the future of development, of sustainable development, and also how 7, soon 8, 9 billion people will be able to develop nationally, locally, but also as a global economy in the years to come, in a manner that does not create further tensions around two fundamental concepts. One, equity, an abstract word to some, but if you look at many of the conflicts in our societies, between societies, then equity clearly is a defining element of the political discourse of our time. And secondly, sustainability. We will, to some extent, focus perhaps a little bit more on the sustainability dimension in today's context, but let me just emphasize that within the United Nations facilitated discussion about development, we have in a document called The Future We Want that was adopted in Rio at the Rio+20 summit, articulated a vision where the economic, the social, and the environmental are not only by aspiration, but increasingly by existential and reality and empirically driven reasons inextricably linked. What I will spend a few moments this morning is to try and share with you, and probably many of you will be not unfamiliar with this, why when we talk about the issue of sustainable financial systems, or perhaps in the words of our work in UNEP, how do we accelerate a transition towards a green economy, an economy that is less polluting, more resource efficient, that also maintains the ecological infrastructure of our planet rather than depleting it? How do we accelerate our ability to move towards these green economies, inclusive green economies? And how, above all, do we retool also some of the key elements that will determine whether we succeed or not? Public policies, but also the ability of entrepreneurs, of the private sector, of investors, of the financial system to evolve in a way that allows a scaled-up investment and also an accelerated capacity to transition. Now, many of you will be familiar with the notion that when we talk about environment and sustainability, particularly in the world of business and finance, for a long time, the issues began to mature in a CSR-like agenda. What we are presenting to you this morning here, and what we will seek your input also throughout the day, is a fundamental rethink of how in the world of business, and particularly of finance, insurance, essentially the financial and capital markets of our global economy, these issues are rapidly moving from a CSR or liability and similar discussions that have happened in the corporate boardrooms and the strategic considerations to what is likely to become the core business of finance. To some, this may seem very futuristic, but I hope in some of what you have already seen and what you will see throughout the day in the presentations from the inquiry, but also of the work that the Swiss team has done. And Bruno, let me at this point also acknowledge your leadership, that of Switzerland, in having embraced the question of what is the role of Switzerland's financial economy and its key players in this global conversation about moving towards a more sustainable finance system. And I want to pay tribute to what yesterday was released in your presence and that of the Advisory Council of the Inquiry in Zurich, the first report on the design of a sustainable financial system here in Switzerland. And you will hear more in a moment from Nick Robbins and from Simon Zadek about the work of the inquiry. But let me just share with you why it is we set out in 2014 to undertake an inquiry that would focus on the question of where will the financing come from to make the transitions in our economies feasible. The first thing is that, we will invest trillions of dollars in infrastructure development in the coming years. This is a given because we will add 3 billion additional people to our global economy. We have the growing income and wealth indicators of many developing nations. You have a continent such as Africa with close to 1 billion people living there today, and yet 3/4 of Africa's citizens in the year 2015 don't have access to electricity services. So however you look at the future, more energy, more water, more food, more transport, essentially more of everything, except, and this is where the challenge of the transition towards a green economy thinking comes to the center, if we continue to provide more people with more services, more products, we cannot do so on the basis of a consumption and production system and economy as it has evolved over the last 100, 150 years. We talk about increasing food production globally by 50 to 70% by 2050 in order to have food security. How do you tally this with a world in which every year we already have a net loss of arable agricultural land occurring? Now, there are some who say, don't worry, science, technology, it'll just happen. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not what the data tells us. It's certainly not saying that we will all be starving by 2050, but reinventing, for example, the agricultural economy of the future, in trying to understand what is going to drive resource efficiency in agriculture, will be critical to the future of a successful agricultural economy as much as to ensuring food security for 8-9 billion people. And here is the corollary. It's not just for agriculture and food. If you know that 70 to 75% of all water use on our planet is in fact occurring through agriculture using it, if you put that alongside the second number, which is that just in 5 to 6 years' time, by 2020, roughly 1/3 of the world's population will be living in places that can be considered water-stressed conditions. Water is not something, and I know it may seem ironic on a day like this sitting here in Switzerland, that we can just assume will be available to us. In fact, in many parts of the world, including in some parts of Europe, in some parts of the year we already have water supply problems. The inextricable links between a sector such as agriculture and the natural resource domain, the ecological infrastructure of our planet, soils, water, our hydrological systems, but also biodiversity, forests, the watersheds of nations that ensure that we actually have access to water, to clean air, these are under stress. And that is why when we talk today about the future of our economies, then the first thing that I would like to say to you is that the environmental dimension, or you could also say the environmental Achilles heel of our economic future, is becoming ever more prominent. And I don't want to bore you now, but if you are interested, I mean, part of our work as the United Nations Environment Programme is to work with the world's leading scientists and experts literally across the whole planet and assemble this data in order for the world to begin to appreciate, first of all, how significant these environmental changes are, and secondly, how fundamental to addressing them will be, first of all, international cooperation, but secondly, also a rethinking of how our economies will move forward. The inquiry has taken the logical next step, which is to ask, well, if we are going to see significant investments in energy, infrastructure, agriculture, how can we make the green economy DNA become more central to determining these investments and to how our economies will be able to utilize these opportunities? For example, low-carbon energy technology instead of fossil fuel-based technology. Buildings that in the year 2020 will not be built like we built buildings in the 1950s. And I think here in Switzerland, you have set an example of how energy efficiency standards simply become the new normal. The new normal of our economies in the coming decades will be that they will be significantly shaped by resource efficiency considerations, by being able to address a phenomenon such as global warming and carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, but also by our capacity to make the economy appreciate that it cannot be a continued premise that economic players in the private sector can exploit our natural resource base, and yet the taxpayer is called upon to then fix the problem. Take the simple phenomenon that we are witnessing just now in Switzerland, and it is a phenomenon that I think is both illustrative and yet just a nanosecond in, let's say, our history. If you look at your weather reports right now and you see the images of a country highly organized, highly focused on precaution, having put a great deal of thought into infrastructure and managing extreme weather events, this is not a singular moment. I have still the images in my own mind. I don't know when it was, about 6 or 8 years ago, when half a village was literally flooded out of existence. The cost of just some of the damage around Lake Geneva in the last few days is in the millions. And this is just a rainfall event. We are confronting at the moment the challenge of a world community that is literally faced with the challenge of moving by the second half of this century to an economy that will essentially have zero net emissions of carbon dioxide. That means no more emissions than that which we can capture and store and sequester either through carbon capture technology. Unlikely as it may seem at the moment, it will probably become an important part of our capacity to do so, but most importantly, our ecological infrastructure. Much of the carbon dioxide that we are already having to measure through the emissions we have today is actually being sequestered in the vegetation, in soils. The continued destruction of that ecological storage capacity will actually make the climate change issue even worse. That's why, for instance, a program such as reducing emissions from deforestation, making forest stocks in our global economy something that we want to increase in order to increase our capacity to store carbon, moves from the ecological and biological realm very quickly into the economic and even into a sector such as insurance. In the UNEP Finance Initiative that we host in UNEP for the past 20 years, and many of your institutions are members of it, we are now at the stage where we are working with you as the insurance sector in trying to understand how can new insurance products become part of the fabric that will allow much more significant private investment in maintaining and expanding forest cover on our planet. And this brings me really to the core of what today's seminar will be about. We are talking about a marketplace and an economy in which green finance, to use a label for the moment, will become massively more important in the coming years. And if I may just draw your attention, in addition to this report that was yesterday presented to us by one of the centers of the financial sector in the world, we are also working with the People's Bank of China. This report here is something that if you're in the business of finance, I would urge you to take a very close look at. By China's own estimates, in the next 5-year plan, its annual needs for green financing in the Chinese economy are likely to be in the range of 320 to 350 billion, not million, billion US dollars per annum. China's own assessment and the People's Bank's estimates are that maybe 15 to 20% of that finance will actually be public finance, which means that, in theory, there are $250 to $280 billion worth of financing business emerging in China, not somewhere in the 21st century, in the next 2 to 3 years. You know how significant a signal this is. And what we are, in the inquiry, trying to understand is, where is innovation in the financial marketplace actually occurring that reflects what we see as an inevitable set of drivers that will change the nature of economic development, of investments, of environmental sustainability, And why is the financial system so slow in being able to capture that? We have this phenomenon that there are literally billions of dollars worth of projects around the world looking for investments. There are trillions of dollars in the financial markets desperately looking for ways to invest. And we would argue and hope that through the discussions today we can get some greater clarity, some greater precision in trying to understand how the market for green finance will move very rapidly from a kind of niche area into one of the defining drivers of a financial and capital market, whether at national or international level. The inquiry is looking for innovations because we do believe that central banks, financial regulatory authorities, alongside the players in the financial and capital markets, are increasingly going to play an important role in trying to intermediate this knowledge gap and also the, if you want, the lagging in translating some of these opportunities. Interestingly enough, some of the most far-reaching innovations that we are finding right now at this interface of central banks and financial regulatory authorities and the domain of green finance and financial and capital markets is not in the traditional transatlantic financial arena. It is, in fact, in emerging and developing economies, because there is still a process of building a financial system, and therefore the narrative of development, the objectives of a development-oriented economic agenda align much more easily also with the development of a financial system and financial markets. Among us today we have the Central Bank Governor of Bangladesh, Dr. Rahman, and he will share with you later in the day some of the measures that a central bank such as that of Bangladesh has taken in making development and finance come together. We have amongst us also the head of HSBC from India, and a country such as India has had a policy of sectoral directed investment guidance from government covering around 40% of investments for many, many years. But there is also green finance, green bonds, new carbon markets emerging in South Africa, in India, in Brazil, stock markets. We have our colleague from UNCTAD here, sustainable stock exchanges, whether Bovespa in Sao Paulo or whether Johannesburg. We are seeing a rapid expansion in an area that is going to be fundamentally critical to this, which is the capacity and competence of key players in the financial and capital markets to better interpret, understand what will drive the future investment arena. And obviously from our perspective, what we would like to bring closer to your attention today is quite how dynamic these innovations are beginning to happen, how in magnitude and in significance they will rapidly change their character. And finally, to echo to Bruno Oberles and the Swiss team's analysis, how important these trends will be to a location such as Switzerland in terms of the global financial system. You are, in many ways, one of the places that we would look to as being on the front line of both innovation and also in terms of facilitation. A highly developed, highly structured, highly professional financial market in which also a legislative environment exists that gives a very clear priority to environmental sustainability, to actions on climate change, to maintaining the quality of the ecological infrastructure. All of this is in place. Interesting enough, financial and capital market innovation at the cutting edge on some of these issues has not necessarily been very visible coming out of Switzerland. And it was, and I want to thank you, Bruno, for having seized the opportunity when we embarked on the inquiry to have made Switzerland one of the countries that is part of our both study in understanding what is actually happening, and more importantly, hopefully, in being part of catalyzing a reflection on Switzerland. Should it not be the center for the expertise, but also of practice and of discourse around the issue of green finance? It should be one of the world's centers, and we hope that out of today and the work that will come, this perhaps is a journey that we might be able to accompany you and work together. Thank you for your interest and have a very good day.